To complete our semester's exploration of cultural anthropology, we'll spend this lecture talking about how anthropology has engaged with the most pressing issues that confront the world today. First, we should review the concept of globalization from the beginning of the semester. Globalization is a whole suite of changes and processes starting a few hundred years ago and really accelerating in the last few decades that have broken down barriers between different cultures worldwide so that different societies are increasingly interconnected and interdependent. The modern world system is the result of the process of globalization. Globalization gets used in two rather distinct senses, as an observable fact and as a policy to either be promoted or worked against. With an increasingly globalized world, many more problems can jump from smaller cultural systems to the whole world system and vice versa. Most of the problems we'll look at here in this lecture are either global in scope or more regional problems that are prompted by global problems. We take those scientific observations about the fact of globalization, then use the applied anthropology approach to determine what our policies concerning globalization should be. Of course, one of the biggest problems confronting the world today is climate change and resource depletion. Climate change is more than just global warming, but rather changes in every aspect of the climate and ecology, including changing sea levels, precipitation, weather patterns, and so on. Such changes can and do radically reconfigure entire ecosystems. Over the long term of global history, climate change has been relatively constant and ongoing. What makes modern climate change such a problem is twofold. First, the current bout of climate change is anthropogenic, caused by human activities. It's not part of the normal, natural fluctuations of global climate. Some politicians and non-scientists argue this point, calling it into question by claiming that there is no scientific consensus on the point. And they're right. A consensus, technically, is a 100% agreement with no dissent at all. This diagram was produced by research by James Powell. It's a pie chart, though you'd be forgiven for not realizing that right away. In 2013 and 2014, Powell and his assistants conducted an exhaustive review of all peer-reviewed scientific journals concerning the environment, climate, and global ecology. They found that out of 24,210 articles about the environment, only 4 authors rejected the idea that humans were causing climate change. That proportion is represented by the almost invisible yellow slice of the pie chart pointing straight up. Even that slice is actually 10 times larger than it really should be. If it were the correct size, it'd be too narrow to represent in the image, narrower than a single pixel. The rest of the pie chart, the blue, represents the proportion of climate scientists who agree that humans are causing global climate change. So no, there isn't total agreement by all scientists, but there is as close to total agreement as there ever can be. The second reason that climate change is a pressing problem for the modern world system is that, whether anthropogenic or not, climate change will destroy that system. The world system is structured on certain assumptions about the availability of resources and the ability of those resources to move around the world. Climate change will change both of those factors, making the current system unviable. No, climate change will not destroy the world. There will still be a world here. It won't destroy the human species. We'll survive. It won't even be the end of civilization. Some form of civilization will survive, but it won't be our civilization. The world that these hypothetical post-climate change humans will live in will be so different from ours as to be unrecognizable. It's not unreasonable or selfish to want our own way of life to endure, and for that to happen, we need to counter climate change. So, if human activities are causing climate change, why and how, and what can we do about it? Anthropology can help to provide some answers. The part of anthropology that studies how human cultures adapt to and interact with their environments is called variously cultural ecology, human ecology, or ecological anthropology. These are all essentially interchangeable terms. In its applied form, when anthropologists try to solve such problems, the field is more often called environmental anthropology. As with many anthropological fields, these specializations are very interdisciplinary, and they often involve biologists, geologists, climatologists, and specialists in many other fields. In general, what we find when we examine the causes of anthropogenic climate change is that the modern world system plays a major role. This makes sense because the current trend of climate change began about the same time as the Industrial Revolution and really sped up with the spread of industrialization in the 20th century. Most traditional local cultures are more or less sustainable in their local environments, making no long-term negative changes to the ecology. But the capitalist world economy, coupled with the core periphery relationships of the world system, breaks that sustainability. The emphasis on extracting resources from the periphery and increasing levels of consumption in the core leads to widespread ecocide, and such radical anthropogenic effects on the environment necessarily have effects on the climate. And this is not even mentioning the effects of greenhouse gases emitted by industrial technologies. One of the most obvious ways we can see the modern world system reconfiguring the environment is through deforestation. Cutting down large numbers of trees has a whole host of ecological effects. The destruction of habitat for wildlife and a loss of all the benefits such wildlife provides, increased soil erosion, increased drying of soils, both of which make agriculture much more difficult, and loss of the future use of the wood. Modern cultures are not the first to deforest their landscapes. Dense populations and cities have always cut down the local forests for a variety of reasons. To clear fields for farming, for building material to house the population, for cooking fuel to prepare the food, or even for fuel to burn limestone to create plaster to plaster the walls of houses. Neolithic houses in what are now Israel and Jordan were plastered because thick plaster walls are cooler in hot summers. But Israel and Jordan are also now mostly treeless because Neolithic farmers cut down all the trees to fuel the plaster fires. The deforestation and accompanying ecological degradation forced Near Eastern cultures to adopt new, less comfortable housing styles. Deforestation has also been blamed for the collapse of whole civilizations. Mayan civilization in the Yucatan probably collapsed when deforested rainforest soils eroded to the point where they couldn't yield crops anymore. Some scholars have suggested that in about 900 AD, the entire Petén rainforest just didn't exist. We also have an excellent example of deforestation right here in the Midwest. The Native American city of Cahokia, outside of modern St. Louis, which had as many as 20,000 inhabitants 800 years ago, may have been abandoned for lack of nearby wood supplies. Modern deforestation is a bigger problem because, as part of the world system, it occurs on a much larger and more global scale. Rather than cutting down trees for pasturage to feed themselves, Brazilian cattle herders are now cutting down huge swaths of the Amazon for ranches that feed billions of people. And as interconnectedness expands around the world, so do road systems that now cut across long stretches of formerly pristine, untouched forest. Past attempts to limit deforestation have been half-hearted in most countries. The largest stands of forest in the world today are mostly in post-colonial peripheral countries, whose economic strategies include resource extraction, including the resource of timber. From many governments' perspectives, a halt to deforestation is not in their political or economic interests. Also, post-colonial nations are often governed on a colonial model, with important decisions made in the capital and little or no concern or consultation with the local communities. Even when governments have attempted to control deforestation, they've often taken a coercive and punitive approach. This is where good applied anthropology can be and has been of great help. Another major issue confronted by environmental anthropologists alongside medical anthropologists are zoonotic diseases. These are diseases that originally existed among animals, but have now spread into the human population. Most of the recent world health crises have been due to zoonotic diseases like Ebola and HIV/AIDS, both of which originated in chimpanzees in West Africa. And of course, the reason you're listening to this online rather than in a classroom is the most recent zoonotic disease. The virus that causes COVID-19 appears to have originated in bats. Zoonotic diseases, again, are not a new phenomenon. As long as people have kept livestock, about 10,000 years, diseases have jumped from the animal populations into humans. But increased populations, increased population densities, and greater mobility of people around the world have spread what used to be limited local problems into global pandemics. Again, the modern world system is largely to blame. All of humans' negative impacts on the environment really trace back to our population. Though there are species that outnumber us, we have an extremely large population, and that population is undergoing an unprecedented explosion, one so big that some people believe the whole planet will be insufficient to support us all. Industrialization has made it possible to feed billions of people. Modern science has also greatly decreased human mortality rates, so that many more people are living for much longer these days. Currently, our population stands at 7.75 billion, and it's growing at a worldwide rate of about 1.08% per annum. That number seems really small, but in fact it's huge. That growth rate means that the population will double roughly every 65 years, barring disruption. 65 years from now, in 2085, if nothing changes, the world population will be roughly 15.5 billion. In 2150, it will double again to 31 billion. Obviously, no one really believes this will happen. Given the trouble the world has with negative environmental changes and malnourishment today, something will intervene well before we reach that point, and it will probably be massive famine, war, or epidemic. So what can be done? First, population growth has to be halted. Total fertility rate should fall. The total fertility rate is the total number of children a woman gives birth to, on average, over the entirety of her reproductive life. Global TFR is a variable that changes over time. For the population to remain constant, TFR must equal the replacement rate, the value of TFR at which population stays constant. On average, each woman should have 2.1 children. 2 children to replace herself and her husband in the next generation, and the occasional woman will have a third child to account for childhood mortality. Today, much of the Western world has reached this birth rate, or even dipped below it. The US TFR is about 1.77, but much of the developing world is still well above it. The worldwide TFR in 2015 was 2.4, and the median third world TFR was above 5. A 2017 estimate even puts the TFR in Niger as high as 7.0. This is one place the applied anthropology approach can clearly offer great aid. Anthropologists have shown that a variety of carefully designed and culturally sensitive programs can have almost immediate effects on fertility rates. Central to these programs is education. Not just education about reproductive issues, but any sort of educational program. Whenever men and women are well educated, they choose to delay having children until their education is complete, and consequently they have smaller families. Meanwhile, improved education has added benefits to the economy and other dimensions of life as well. But even if we halted population growth tomorrow, that wouldn't resolve the population pressures we're experiencing today. So a second change that must take place to avoid population crashes is to more equitably distribute resources. Some scholars believe that the amount of resources produced in the world today are more than enough to provide a stable, comfortable way of life for 7.75 billion people. The only problem is that the United States and a few other countries consume a much greater percentage of the world's resources than their populations alone would suggest. This means that many developing nations are left with considerably fewer resources than their populations warrant. It's possible that a more equitable distribution of the resources we already have would alleviate some of the problems that cause population crises like war or epidemic. To give you a sense of what that would entail, let's do some extremely simplified back-of-the-envelope calculations. The world's GDP in 2019 was about $88.08 trillion for a population of about 7.75 billion. So an equitable distribution of resources would equate to a per capita income of $11,365 per person per year. This is a major increase in standard of living for many developing nations, but a huge reduction for the developed world. The U.S. per capita income in 2019 was $55,100 per person per year, so the average American would take almost a 79% pay cut. However, the per capita income in Haiti in 2019 was only $731 per person per year. Haitians would receive a 1,455% pay raise. But such an equitable distribution of resources would disrupt the core periphery relationships of the world system. Now resources would no longer be concentrating in the core. This would mean that the capitalist world economy would have to be restructured in a very fundamental way. Every nation on Earth would be a semi-periphery country, and the corresponding shift of wealth would mean a corresponding shift of political power. In other words, equitable resource distribution is fundamentally at odds with the modern world system. The time might be coming when we have to choose between the world system as we know it and massive population disasters. The massive population explosion brought on by industrialization and the hugely increased mobility made possible by globalization have also produced many modern problems that have little to do with the physical environment. Instead, they have to do with the social environment. Today, ethnic groups are forced to interact with radically different cultural traditions at a rate never before encountered in human history. As I said toward the beginning of the course, globalization in many ways is basically a process of spreading Western cultural particularities into worldwide cultural generalities. Capitalism and colonialism, after all, are Western ideas. The particularly Western flavor of globalization is often called Westernization, a worldwide acculturation to Western cultural traditions. It has also been condemned as cultural imperialism, essentially a subtle form of forced diffusion. But other cultural traditions are also spread through globalization, as in the world music movement and Bollywood movies. Such acculturation is driven in part by the movement of people around the world. Today, it's much more likely that you'll encounter a person of a different cultural background than in the past. This means that many ethnic groups are no longer geographically restricted as they were in the past, but rather they form diasporas, communities that have spread from an original ancestral homeland. Some diasporas are voluntary, others are not. Some are motivated by economic factors, others by political or social factors. But all diaspora communities carry with them their ethnic identities, and all must acculturate to some degree to the majority culture in which they come to live. Likewise, the majority culture changes to adjust to the presence of the new minority group. As cultural ideas globalize, they may also indigenize. Indigenization is the process by which borrowed cultural forms are modified to better fit their new cultural context. Thus, McDonald's serves different foods in different nations, and Hollywood movies are edited differently in China than they are in the United States. While the core idea remains largely the same, the precise expression of it changes to a local form. This brings us to another aspect of globalization, reactions to it. Modern indigenous rights movements often call for indigenous people to regain the power to control their own participation in the world system, to indigenize the parts they want, and to reject the others. Sometimes such movements take the form of outright rejections of all outside influences, in which case they're often called autochthonous or nationalistic movements. Such movements are not necessarily discriminatory, but they often are. Since many of these issues are very much shaped by local concerns and circumstances, it's hard to say anything more about them in general. In conclusion, I know this lecture can come across as depressing and pessimistic, but the optimistic lesson to be learned is that anthropology, and more generally science, allows us to think about these problems in a productive manner. Earlier cultures couldn't even conceive of problems on such a large scale. And while we still struggle with finding solutions, at least we're able to understand the obstacles confronting us. With the proper use of science and our cultural predisposition to work together for the benefit of all, we will be able to pull together and solve these problems.